I want to move on to talk about what really is the role of the director. And I remember when I was in a VP role at a company and presenting to the board, I thought that the board's main job was to ask me really hard questions. Challenge me, make me think more deeply, clarify my strategy, make sure, sometimes it was a test. Am I on my toes? Do I know my business? But the reality of board service is that it's so much more than that. And in fact, there's a lot of legal duties that are incumbent upon being a director. And Travis, if you'd like to start by lay out some of those duties that are critical.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do so. So we'll talk in the context of Delaware law, but most other states are very similar. The fundamental basis of all of this is that the responsibility for management of the company vests with the board of directors, and then you delegate that to your officers, right? And then in doing that delegation, you wind up with two main fiduciary duties. You get a duty of care and you get a duty of loyalty. What does that really mean? What it doesn't mean is not showing up to board meetings, not paying attention, not doing your homework, right? The duty of care does not mean you have to be perfect, but you do have to take the amount of care that an ordinarily prudent person would use in similar circumstances. So what does that mean? You show up to the meetings. You inform yourself of all material information reasonably available to you. You seek to understand what it says. You do your homework. You take enough time to actually understand it. You engage in discussion and deliberation on those issues. And then you know that you can rely on your officers, employees, other directors, like a committee, and reasonably selected outside experts to help you in that decision making. Again, it's not perfection, but it's important to know that putting in the time, actually participating, is almost as important as the outcome itself. The second duty, just to hit it while we're on this, is the duty of loyalty. Used to be that was just, hey, make sure that what you're doing is in the best interest in the corporation and its stockholders. You need to be disinterested. Don't act for your personal interest over those of the corporation and the stockholders. And don't be beholden or non-independent of other people that do have personal differentiated interests. That's really expanded over the last maybe 30 years. You hear the word caremark, and that gets a lot of people's skin crawling about, an expansion of the responsibility of a director. You think in the 1980s, there's a lot of rubber stamping. Now there's this duty of oversight that we hear about in the news all the time. That's establishing oversight over all of the critical risks of the company, and then making sure that the board itself follows up. You can't just let the management team do that. The board has to do that. And so there are a lot of examples where this has come up, either an ice cream company in food safety, an airplane company in flight safety, or fast food restaurants and culture of sexual harassment, right? If you sit by and you haven't gotten into the weeds of what's going on from a reporting and then run those red flags to ground, you may find yourself in a bad position from a liability perspective. And that's just fiduciary duties, right? If you're a public company, you've got layers and layers of other responsibilities, Sarbanes-Oxley, stock exchange, securities laws. There's the FTC, the FCC, the FERC, and the other alphabet soup of the government that is going to impose duties. You've got different stakeholders that are going to set expectations, whether that's investors and the street, or it's ESG stakeholder, employee engagement. There are activists from any of those groups that'll come and tell you whether you're doing a good job, or more often that you're not. And just to hit the point, because I know it's a question that we get a lot, is that different in private companies? And the short answer is no. You don't have a difference in your fiduciary duties at a private company from a public company. There are some exceptions to that. An LLC, you can actually write in and say that the fiduciary duties are waived. but usually that's not going to happen for you. So if you think it has, make sure that general counsel talks to you about that. I guess one thing just to hit on, because I don't want to scare anybody, is, okay, so let's say I'm actually showing up, I'm doing my job, I'm paying attention. Can I actually get protected from liability and lawsuit associated with it? Just to put this aside. Yes, that's what exculpation, which is a fancy word for exempting you from monetary liability, indemnification, D&O insurance, and all of these other things that you should be checking into before you accept a position would cover. Just make sure that you understand that doesn't protect you if you're interested in the transaction or you're not independent. And more importantly, it's only as good as, the piece of paper and the person that's promised to cover your legal expenses. But away from the legal point, let me just say there's real responsibility, right? You are going to have to find this as something where you put time and effort into. You've got to learn that company. You don't have to know as much about it as the CEO, but you have to put a diligent effort into learning the company. And that's why you've got the company, its advisors, and great places like NACD to help you in that.
So there's so much there to dig into more deeply. I'm going to start at the end because I always find D&O insurance is a really interesting topic. Are there questions you would recommend people ask about the D&O policies of the boards that they're asked to serve on that you think are the most important questions to ask?
Sure. I always say get a copy of it and then ask what the gaps are. Right? D&O insurance policies have express exceptions in them. There are a lot of things that are excluded. Not every policy is the same, so it's worth checking and seeing what's covered and what's not. Until you've done that, you can't even begin to have the conversation. But a lot of people don't even do it. They just say, okay, D&O insurance, check, we're done.
Right. Reading the documents is always a really painful process when lawyers are very good at, but for most people, knowing the document exists is enough. But sometimes buried deeply in the documents is the thing that is going to trip you up or be a red flag. So I think when you talk about this risk and the potential risks of being a director, right, it falls into an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I would love any of us to comment on if you were offered a board seat and we're looking at the company, what are the red flags that might tell you should think twice about whether to join this board? What things twig your spidey sense?
Well, let me just jump in, Chris, and I want to tackle with the D&O insurance first, and then I'm going to come back to the answer to the question. In all the years I've been doing search work, I have never found a board member to turn down a position once they were told there was D&O insurance. And so I'm coming back to what Travis is saying, which is so spot on. Read it. People say yes to joining a board once that box has been checked without any knowledge about what the exceptions are that Travis just referred to. To me, though, I'm going to come back to your bigger question, which is really this. You will be interviewing with the board, unless it's a company coming out of restructuring, you will be interviewing with the board on their very best day and on their best behavior. And what you really want to know is, what does that board look like on its very worst day? Travis referred to activists, but there are lots of other crises that can come across. And so to me, it's all about, is this a team that you trust and know will work collectively together for the best interests of the shareholders, the stakeholders, and the broader community? And if you don't have that trust, I don't care what the D&O insurance says, you should not be joining that board.
Yeah, you got to imagine you're with those 10 people stranded on a desert island for a few weeks with very few resources. And do you really want to be with them? Are they the folks you want in your boat?
And Chris, it sounds obvious to say this. The teamwork matters, but not enough candidates actually interview in and around the board when they're selecting. Coming back to this notion that we see lots of people who get to a point in their career where joining a board is sort of like joining the country club. It's what's expected of you versus really why are you joining it. But when you are joining it, while they're interviewing you, I can't emphasize enough the notion that you should be interviewing them in the same context. They're going to take references on you. You need to also take references on them. Maybe not in a very obvious way, but these are people who will be well known in the business community. Find out, do some soft referencing around, are these people that I can trust on the worst day of my board service, not on the best day.
I also think there's things that you can observe about a board that is data that over time, sometimes I wish I had taken more notice of. Board turnover, particularly if you're starting with looking at a nonprofit board that is going to lead in and be a start of your board service. If that board's turning fast, in nonprofits, you're not paid. So often it's easier to cut and run than to stay and work to improve the business. So that to me is a flag. Obviously, litigation, accounting restatements are pretty obvious things, but I think also even board composition is an interesting signal about whether this is the group that you want to be a part of, and whether you think the board composition is healthy for the kind of business that you're joining. Sorry, I lost my train of questions here.
Chris, if I could add something, this is David Prang. In doing board searches, one of the things I've admired on some of the candidates that I've dealt with is their desire to have a one-on-one dinner or something with the CEO. Reason being, if the board's there and everything can be fine with the board, but if there's going to be a problem, it's going to start, internally on that. And you want to know, I think, who that CEO is, and is that someone you want to be on the island with?
Yes.
Yeah, and David, I think that's a great point. And let me just add to that, which is the dynamic of the CEO board process is super important. So, is the CEO as supportive of you joining the board as the board is? Because if you think that on most days the board wants to be supportive of the CEO, if you get the sense that you're not all on the same page, this is the time to find out. Because we've seen plenty of situations where boards will impose their candidates without the reverse, meaning, the CEO really thinks that this board member could be a good addition to the board, and the CEO could and would want to learn and work with the board member.
I guess kind of rounding this out, there's a difference between, Steve and David, Chris, I'd like your thoughts on this. Getting that first board seat and getting, the second or fifth, or you're rolling off and you're looking for another. I think there's a level to which people can be choosy when they're a reputable long-term director. I think there are folks that might not have that same type of flexibility for their first paid directorship. That being said, it's kind of like a marriage. Like, you don't want to get into that bad directorship, particularly if it's a board where, to Chris's point, you either don't fit or you don't trust them or something like that. That can have long-term consequences for your ability to get nominated to subsequent boards.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. And I do think the question of, it circles back to your first conversation, Travis, about the duties on a board. And I think one point I'd like to highlight from that is that process protects you, right? Because if under the business judgment rule, there's a lot of things that you can make a different judgment than someone else might have made. But if you followed good process, done your due diligence, learned what you need to do, deliberated appropriately, you're protected in that circumstance. So to me, one of the interesting questions here is it a board? Because there are some boards that ignore process, right? And that's something culturally sometimes you can see before you get on, that even if you don't agree with everyone on the board, if they're following good process, you're at least not going to take on legal risks as a result of bad fundamentals in the board structure.
Absolutely. There are bad boards. I mean, that's the way to put it. There are some boards out there that are bad. Usually it happens more in the private company context because they just haven't had to, they haven't really had investor scrutiny. They haven't had to deal with the quarterly earnings cycles. They haven't had to set up audit, nom-gov, compensation committees and deal with those things, even though they probably should anyways. And they also haven't paid for good advice at that point either, right? It's some advisors that have been appointed either by the CEO or a venture capital or private equity fund, and that's good enough for now, and we can worry about scrutiny later on down the road. Those, particularly if you're an educated director that's interested in governance, you can bring a lot of value to. I mean, you really can. Just think about, the time and effort and energy that'll go into that.
Travis, you mentioned private boards, but if I might just add to that, boards with controlling shareholders can equally be bad. You really have to find out how much will your voice be listened to, even though you've been appointed to this board.
Yes, and some of us are gluttons for punishment. Right. I mean, I love a good challenge. I love seeing a board that I think, oh, I can really help this company improve and this board improve. And so my final piece of advice on this topic would be back to the documents, but beyond the D&O insurance, I would look at the bylaws, right? If you're going into a situation where the company's changing and needing to improve its governance, sometimes that can be hampered by what's really in the docs underneath about how the company should be governed. And I personally have had the experience of not reading them until I was well on the way of a year into the board and discovering some things that are like, oh, this is going to make our improvement journey so much more difficult. So the fine print is really worth paying attention to. But I just want to touch for 1 second on your reference to the duty of oversight that is more important now than before with some of the newer case law and some of the liability there. And what would you recommend to directors to be sure is in place to make sure that the board is fulfilling that duty of oversight?
So it varies depending on the stage and the resources and the size of the company. Obviously, a startup is not going to be able to put in the types of robust risk management that General Electric has. But the key is probably in your interviews to accept the board position, you should ask, what are the mission critical risks of this business? Some of them are obvious. Again, with the ice cream company, it's food safety. With the planes, it's manufacturing and flight safety. But some of them might not be as obvious. And then there are others that are just ubiquitous, like cybersecurity and human resources, human capital, those types of issues. You want to make sure that there is some kind of built-in upward reporting function that goes to the board. It is not enough that management says, don't worry, we've got this, we're going to be good. The case law is crystal clear that the duty of oversight belongs to the board and cannot be delegated. Now, you can have management set up different systems that report to them and report to the board, but there's usually that hotline, something like that, where the employees can call to the board. Are you going to have a hotline in a startup? Probably not. Is that something that you can suggest and have adopted? Yeah, absolutely. And a CEO that kind of puts their foot down in the interview process against that, it's probably a red flag there. It's a regular, so boards should regularly evaluate the systems and think about what improvements, if any, are necessary. Time goes on, businesses change, the law changes. And so you want to make sure that you're not frozen into 1990s, but you're evolving along with the business and legal reality that you live in.
I liken it a little bit to going in for your annual physical and the doctor runs the blood panel and does the x-ray and does the EKG. And what you hope is there's nothing the matter. But sometimes there's something the matter and then you can dig in. But if you're not doing the screening, that's where the board can be liable for lack of oversight if they're not paying attention.
Yeah.
So
Ask questions. The best thing you can do as a director is just be willing to confess ignorance to something and say, I don't know. Can you tell me? Help me out here. I want to know. I want to understand.
here's an interesting question about this concept of fit for the board, and touches on, Steve, your comments on diversity and equity and inclusion. So if you're being brought in as a board candidate as a diverse candidate, and that's what the board sees as your fit, how do you think about fit for yourself in that circumstance? And whether it can be good when you're brought in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure there's a perfect answer, and I'm not sure I'm the perfect one to give the answer. However, I will say this. You need to make sure that the commitment of the company, the executives in the company, is on a parallel track with that of the board. If you see this happening at the board level, but you're not seeing an equal commitment to diversity in the company, I would question whether I'm being brought on, I hate to use the term tokenism, but more in that vein than a serious corporate commitment to do the right thing with respect to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So that's where I would really look and ask the hard questions. If you are a single or double diversity candidate, the reality is you're going to have several options ahead of you, just given the pressures to diversify boards. And I think you need to ask the hard questions, but in a very, I don't want to say the word collegial, but in a way that shows that you're trying to solve the problem, that you're not trying to double down on the problem, right? So ask the questions up front, because once you're in, this is the thing that we haven't really talked about, but there's a moral obligation, unless there's a financial reason, to stay with a board for a longer period of time than you might have in an executive role. So joining a board and leaving a year later because you don't like what you see is really not an acceptable option.
And I'll just say there's a big difference between public and private companies in this. Any public company that has, as Steve said, 9 white men at this point, the chair of their nom-gov last year got voted against or had a recommendation of withhold. And the institutional investors, they inflamed about that type of a situation. And so if somebody's coming to you right now to be the very first diverse candidate, there are 2 things going on. One, that's probably why, not because they have a belief in diversity, but because they've been fighting for years and now they don't have a choice. But 2, you really have an opportunity to be an instrument for change in that company, and they probably need it, and the investors and the stockholders probably need that as well. If that's one of the governance issues they probably have others. And you can be a force for good on that board. They are required to include you in all full board meetings. You don't have to feel like an outsider. It's the obligation of the company to, keep you involved and keep you informed.
But it's interesting, Travis, because first of all, I agree with you, but there's so much unconscious bias that takes place on boards. I mean, just think of, how do they get together? Where do they get together? What sporting activities do they do that might or might not be inclusive of all the board members? And so you need to really feel that this board is committed to change. And Chris, would love to hear your view, obviously, committed to the changes that they are talking about, and not just talking about them, but living them.
I've been very lucky in my career that on all of my public boards, I've been the 3rd woman. And often people talk about the fact that when there are 3, you're no longer a representative of your status, right? But you can be yourself, right? There's enough women in the room. And I've, had the pleasure at Key of doing CEO selection, where we selected the first woman CEO in the banking industry, when we had, I believe, 6 of 14 board members were women. So there was no question in the room, to your point about unconscious bias, there was no way people could come into the room and just side question, say, do you think she can handle it? You know, that question was off the table.
Yeah.
So the environment does matter. And I think, I would think more, it's definitely more challenging when you're the first. And it's also more challenging when you don't see a mirrored behavior within management. So I would double click on that perspective, that you want to see it at both sides to see a true commitment. So.
We recently did a search for a company where the nominating committee, where they were very seriously, with tremendous sincerity, looking for diversity. The nominating committee was 3 white men. And we had to say to the nominating committee, that may be how you've created this committee. That committee is not going to work effectively when you parade all these people in to meet with you, and they look at the 3 of you and say, do you really believe what you're saying? So what we did is we shifted things around to make sure that we had something other than the nominating committee part of the process, so that they, you know, that because there were other diverse members on the board, just happened not to be on the nominating committee. So you got to look at all those subtle clues along the way to make sure that you are joining the group you want to be joining.